Bitcoin has no intrinsic value. That's what Dimon is saying, the CEO of JP Morgan. And I tend to agree with this, surprisingly. Right? He does say other things that I do not agree with, but that Bitcoin has no intrinsic value does make a lot of sense, actually. Now, this is a very fundamental discussion, right? Almost a philosophical discussion. But it is, I think, very important to look at the critics of Bitcoin and look at their points and look at how valid are those points potentially. And the point of Bitcoin not having intrinsic value, I think, does have some merit to it. It does not change my opinion, though, on whether or not to buy and hold Bitcoin. More on that later. So, what is intrinsic value? I think intrinsic value means it has value in itself. It has value beyond just being exchanged to something. Okay, so you have value simply just by owning it. You have utility from just owning it or from using it for something. So, for example, if you have, let's say, wheat, okay, you've got a farm, you grow wheat, then you use maybe that wheat to exchange it for some other good. You have intrinsic value in that wheat, right? You can turn this into food. You also have intrinsic value even in things like gold, right? You could use that gold and place it into teeth to repair your teeth. You could also, if you regard this as intrinsic, do some jewelry with it, right? Sell the jewelry, and people just love to wear jewelry. So there's maybe some kind of intrinsic value in this as well. Now, with Bitcoin, it's not necessarily true, right? Bitcoin does not really have intrinsic value. What can you really do with it? You can't grow food with it. You can't live in it, right? With a house, you can live in it. You also can't put it on a wall like with art. But this is where I think the differentiation of what kind of value an asset has is important. There is, on the one hand, the intrinsic value, right? And people say when something doesn't have intrinsic value, it doesn't have any value at all. But I tend to disagree with this. There's also speculative and utilitarian value. And that's, I think, where Bitcoin shines. So all of these assets, or most of those assets that I was talking about, they have both components, actually. When you buy a house, right, you don't just buy it for the utility of living in it. You also buy it maybe as a retirement vehicle, right? You're okay, you're willing to pay so much for that house to get this huge mortgage on it because you expect it to appreciate. You expect the value to go up. Thus, you have some kind of speculative value in it as well, right? If the house was to completely collapse, all the houses are so poorly built that they all completely collapse after 20 years. Or maybe there's a law. After 20 years, you have to completely demolish your house. How much would houses really be worth? They would be worth much less, right? Even if you maybe only have the intention to live in it for 20 years, it would still be worth much less because you don't anticipate this to appreciate. So you've got the speculative utility value and you've got the intrinsic value. And when we have something like, let's say, for example, art has a huge component of speculative value because how much value do you really have from art hanging on your wall? Okay, there's not that much value. Maybe you can like show off and you can tell, oh, I've got a big art collection, etc. But the value itself, the intrinsic value of a piece of art isn't millions of dollars as some of these art pieces are sometimes sold for. So most of that is also simply just speculation, hoping for somebody else to buy it afterwards for more. Now, what about things like stocks? This is now where it becomes a bit more complicated, right? Do stocks have intrinsic value? You can't grow anything. You can't eat any stock, right? Nowadays, you often have it just in your brokerage account as well. You can't even touch it, right? It's just a record in some database, similar to Bitcoin. So what's the intrinsic value of stocks? The idea is that the intrinsic value of stocks is their cash flow. So we could now open a whole other can of worms of all the stocks that don't pay cash flow, right? Growth stocks or Berkshire Hathaway or so that never pay any dividends. But let's not open that. Let's assume that all stocks actually do have cash flow. And the cash flow determines their intrinsic value, right? You hold the stock, you've got value in holding the stock because it gives you some kind of passive income, right? That would be the argument of stocks. But is this really intrinsic? Is it kind of value in itself that it generates cash flow? You still would have to convert the cash flow into something. And this is then where we get into fiat. Does a dollar bill have intrinsic value? Can you use it by itself? The answer is no, right? You have to swap it for something. You don't necessarily have speculative value, right? You're not anticipating the value of your dollar bills to increase, at least in most part of the world, right? Some people, they might be exchanging their local currency into dollars because they think the dollars might appreciate versus their local currency. But most people, they simply just hold dollars for another reason. And that's the utility reason. It's the reason that you can exchange it for something else in the future. Right? That's the assumption. It's very liquid. You can exchange it basically for anything, for any goods and services. So there's no real intrinsic value, but there's still value. It's different value. It's the value of its utility. And the utility in this case is the big network that you can swap or that you can exchange your fiat for into something else. The big acceptance of fiat. Now, Bitcoin in that regard is similar to stocks and to fiat. You can't really do anything with it, you can't eat it, but there is some kind of belief in it. But it's obviously not as big as for fiat, right? Everybody believes in fiat, so to speak, right? Everybody accepts fiat. A lot of people sell their time for fiat. With Bitcoin, not necessarily. It's only a small number of people that actually do it. But why is Bitcoin still preferred by this core believers of people over fiat and over stocks? It's because of its inherent utilitarian properties that are different to fiat and that are different to stocks, but that are still there, right? So with fiat, you've got the big utility, even though there's no intrinsic value. With fiat, you've got the big utility of exchanging it with everything. With stocks, you've got the big utility that over the long term, it doesn't depreciate versus the inflation, right? It keeps the purchasing power versus inflation, maybe even increases with it. So that's the advantage of stocks. It does have obviously the downside of its volatility, right? Stocks are very volatile, but over the long term, inflation can't do much to it. Fiat is not as volatile, but at least you can change it with everything. Now, what's so good with Bitcoin? With Bitcoin, you've got the advantage that it's globally accepted and that you can easily move it across borders and that it's also protected against inflation. So you've got the advantage of stocks in the form that it doesn't depreciate, right, over the very, very long term. You've got the disadvantage that you can't swap it as easily as fiat, right? People work on this with the Lightning Network, but who knows where this in the end goes, right? It's not necessarily the reason why people buy Bitcoin nowadays. It's rather to hold it in a similar pattern to stocks. But the advantage over stocks is you can transfer them easier across countries. You can transfer also larger amounts easier across countries. And you have less of a third-party risk, ideally, if you do self-custody. Right? If you hold Bitcoin, obviously, on Binance or FTX, that's a different story. If you hold stocks, there is still some kind of insurance here and there, and you're hoping that the company isn't frauding you, but still, in the end, you have to trust your broker, that nothing shady is going on. With Bitcoin, you hold this in your own wallet. You move any amount you want to another country. You can transfer it to any person in the world for relatively cheaply if that person happens to also be a Bitcoiner. So those are the main advantages. It's kind of like, I see Bitcoin less as a competitor to fiat. I see Bitcoin more as a competitor to stocks, because you've got a similar kind of volatility. You've got the similar attribute of trying to park your money. The advantages of it is it's not as highly correlated as, say, an individual stock to an index. So you've got less correlation, you can easily diversify, and you have somewhat of a safety of keeping it even if some crazy regulation goes on, right? Who knows, right? Maybe the world becomes so hostile against people that have some wealth that stock portfolios might be taxed heavily. You can't do this with Bitcoin. You've got some kind of a hedge against very hostile regulatory environments. Now, is this something worth to you? Who knows, right? Maybe you are not traveling around different countries all the time. But the fact that it does have some utility to some people gives, in my opinion, the reason for its existence. That's why it has value. It doesn't have intrinsic value, it has utilitarian value because it has some properties other assets don't. And that's where I kind of agree. So you see Jamie Dimon saying it doesn't have intrinsic value, all fine, but it does have some other kind of value, as do fiat and as do stocks, right? Stocks are basically a derivative of fiat. So if you found this interesting, right, feel free to again give this a thumbs up. Feel free to subscribe in case you haven't yet. Feel free to share, of course, as well, right? This channel is not growing in these current times, so any kind of new viewers are, of course, also very much appreciated. And see you in the next video as well. Bye-bye.